All right. We want to get going?
Sure.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to our emergency shelter training here this evening. I'm Christy Lemoyne. I am the volunteer coordinator for the Berkshire and Franklin County Medical Reserve Corps units. A lot of you are members with us. I know some people are not. So I just wanted to take a moment to briefly explain what the Medical Reserve Corps is, for those who are not aware. So it was a group that was established after 9/11, after seeing a need for some organization around emergency help. It's a network of over 200,000 volunteers nationwide. It's organized locally with the goal of helping to improve health and safety in the community. So it's local people that are getting involved in their own communities that are pre-credentialed, pre-trained, and organized for local responses within their own communities. Some of our local assistance or projects that we've done with our two units around the past year or so have included things like COVID testing, vaccination clinic staffing, some art resilience programs, some oral history around COVID experiences, assisting with food access for vulnerable populations. So we got a lot going on in our communities. We also have some response teams, some canine therapy groups, a communications team, a disaster animal response, and a children's emergency response team. So if you're interested in learning more about Medical Reserve Corps, I will put the link to our website in the chat for anyone that is not a member and interested. And in the meantime, another project that we could be involved in and fortunately have not needed to is something like emergency shelter setup, which is what we're talking about this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Liisa Jackson. Liisa is an amazing MRC staff member, I guess we'd call her. Certainly supporting the ideals of Medical Reserve Corps and all that we do. She's a director for seven current units, Liisa?
Yep.
7 MRC units in the state of Mass. She's got some great awards under her belt, the Mentor Award from the Surgeon General's office and the National MRC office, some awards from the USA Today, a Caring Award for Excellence. She's been involved in a ton of initiatives around the state, H1N1 responses, staffing during the floods in Massachusetts with the Red Cross, things like that. So she is coming to us with a wealth of knowledge, and we're very excited to welcome her.
Thank you. Am I ready?
Absolutely. If anyone has any questions as we get going, go ahead and put them in the chat or raise your hand with the reactions button, and we'll try and handle those as they make sense to be.
Yeah, and I can see the chat just to the left to me too. So Chrissy, you can always just, if there's like a question that needs me to verbally answer it, let me know. But hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this class, and I was very excited when Corinne and Christy asked me to come do it because I haven't done it in a while. I've actually done shelter operations across the state many times. The 2011 tornadoes in Springfield and West Springfield, I helped manage the shelter at the Big E, and then at the Mass Mutual, and then you know, sheltering down the Cape. Like there's always some kind of sheltering going on. We have done warming centers, and kind of what we've been doing lately, I was worried, you know, these last few storms, we've set up like small warming centers in communities. Oh, and, yeah. So that's a lot. I have a lot of background in sheltering, and it's probably, you know, a strong area of expertise that I have because I've done so much different stuff. I'm trying to get to the next slide, so sorry about that. I'm not sure. I apologize for, oh, there we go. I don't know if you did it, Christy, or I did. I think I just hit the cursor. So anyway, different types of shelters we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about individual considerations. That's probably one of the most challenging parts is the people that do come that need sheltering during a storm or a flood or a hurricane or any kind of event where they have to evacuate their homes. We've actually set up sheltering for gas explosions. You probably know about that in North Andover, and Lawrence. That was a 4-month deployment, believe it or not, and which was kind of crazy. And then, you know, early on we had gas explosions on the North Shore, and it was actually the community that the people that were the most affected were a deaf community. So that brought on significant challenges. We're going to talk about shelter roles and responsibilities and client interactions. We'll talk about in the shelter because that's usually where some of the issues come up. So let me try that again. So we'll talk about what is a shelter, types of shelters, various agencies involved. Shelters they've changed the definition over the last, probably I'd say the last 15 years. Before you had to meet a certain criteria, but what we more see is a warming shelter being set up or a cooling shelter. And we try to make it as temporary as we can, but sometimes that doesn't work. So, are you guys getting feedback? I just got feedback. Okay, that's good.
It was somebody's speaker. I'm trying to catch everyone and mute them.
Oh, as they mute, yeah, come in.
Yeah.
Okay, in this module, my next one, sorry. So really what you're doing is in a shelter is you're providing food and water, temporary residence, client services, and a safe space. It's kind of like a big household, the way I look at it with rules. You know, not all households have really strong rules, but in a shelter, you kind of need strong rules just because everybody needs to have a good understanding of what the expectation of behavior and sleep time and all of that is. It's not the same as a home, but you know, we really, rules are what save us all, and they're not strict. They're just, you know, you just need to have some basic rules in place, and that's something that can also keep you out of trouble when you open up a shelter. That's usually what I've seen as a problem when they don't know the rules and someone's up playing music late or something, you know, like that. There's diversity in shelters. For example, the tornadoes in Springfield and West Springfield. In West Springfield, the population got hit were Nepalese, Bhutanese, and from the Islamic community. So we didn't have a lot of, so language was an issue, and thank God we had some younger people that were able to write the rules in Nepalese, Bhutanese, and different Islamic languages. And there was a food issue when we were there, just because those folks don't always eat food that, you know, like is typically served at a shelter, which is mostly stuff in packages. You know, there's cultural languages, you know, cultures, languages, ages, abilities, physical and cognitive. We dealt with a group home that came in 2007 in the ice storms, and that was particularly challenging, but we were able to kind of figure it out. Medical needs, socioeconomic statuses, and experiences and beliefs. So it's really hard when you start cramming a bunch of people in a small room where their beds have to be next together when there's such diversity, and that's usually where most of the problems arise. And then different types of shelters, you know, it can be a hurricane. We don't do a lot of house fires, but over the years, on the North Shore, our MRC volunteers would help out with house fires, and that's very temporary. Usually, you know, pretty quickly the Red Cross comes in and gives hotel vouchers, and it's a little bit easier to deal with. Slow rising flood. We've had earthquakes, but nothing that have displaced people. And I look in the header, and dietary needs are very challenging in shelters. So that's something, you know, vegan, gluten-free, religious needs. Luckily, most of the food pantries at this day and age has all these supplies, and most grocery stores do. 10 years ago, that was not the case. So you have to kind of make things work with that. But I'll talk about a few stories with the food issues that have come up over the years. And, tornadoes, obviously. Winter storms seem to be our biggest need for opening shelters, mostly because the power goes out. And then there's an extended period of cold where people can't shelter in place. And in fact, the ice storms were particularly devastating because, I don't know if any of you remember it. I don't know if it went as far west as you guys, but it just like devastated the power system, and the roads were covered with trees, and it was really very difficult. So what happened is a lot of homes were not inhabitable anymore. So the pipes would freeze, and then the houses, would get flooded with water and ice. And so they weren't safe to inhabit anymore. So that brought up some particular challenges as well. Kind of your basic needs are met at a shelter. You have dormitory, which is where everybody sleeps. You have obviously food services, which is kind of a kitchen or cafeteria. Sometimes that's in the dormitory. Every shelter I've set up, we've set up medical services, just because we're lucky enough. We have a lot of medical volunteers, and that's something I'd like to have in place in the shelter. And I like behavioral health as well. That's another thing that's I find it extremely important in a shelter as well, if you have it. Comfort centers and personal care stations, that's very challenging. For example, in most of the places, actually the Big E was the best because it was a dormitory for 4-H. So they're big shower rooms, big areas for, lots of bunk beds. So it was probably the best scenario shelter wise. But a lot of times it'll be in a school, or like in Fitchburg's case, it was an old armory. There were literally like 3 bathrooms, male and female, and we had at the height 300 plus occupants. So that was incredibly challenging to try to figure all that out. So it worked, but it wasn't easy. And then, we mostly what we look at in our state is mostly warming, but we do activate cooling shelters. And most of the times there'll be a senior center or a library, a public building where people can come during the day and cool off and then go back home and possibly sleep in their home. They may or may not contain showers. They used to be required to have showers, but
You
now
take
they
this off
really,
and put it on, or how do you? No, it's good.
so they would require showers, but now even in 2007 we had to make do. We were in the armory and we had people walking up the street at the Y, and we've actually been really lucky. A lot of gyms and health clubs, if they have power, they will offer showers to folks that are in the shelters, which has been an incredible resource. And then charging stations, particularly now where people, that's their main source of communication. So it's nice to have power strips in areas that are charging stations. In fact, in the gas explosions up in the north, we actually had this beautiful trailer that had a charging station, but it was a locker. So people could leave their computers in there. It was expensive, but they could leave their computers or any devices they needed to charge in there to charge and lock it back up in a locker. So I thought that was brilliant. And that was a really easy way to deal with that, because that becomes a tricky situation. We'll talk about who's responsible for sheltering. Government's responsible for protecting citizens. In our state, we have 351 kingdoms. So, usually it's a local effort. And then sometimes there's a regional shelter, but local emergency management has the ultimate responsibility. And generally that's a fire chief, police chief, and sometimes a health director or a town manager or things like that. But that's it. In our state particularly, it's a local. We've had a lot of discussion about regional shelters, and we have like a lot of times we'll open up little shelters and then we migrate to one of the bigger ones that has the most capacity. But generally it starts out locally, and that's why the MRC is so important. We partner with pretty much any organization that's involved in this. So obviously Medical Reserve Corps, community emergency response teams, Red Cross, they're amazing for resources. Their volunteer pool isn't as big as it used to be, but they're great with resources. Faith-based partners for staffing and services. The Salvation Army, I'm going to toot their horn a little bit because we've used them for food services. They already have food trucks in the communities, and they will come up and provide food for your shelters, because food is always very challenging, because if you start cooking, you have to open up the kitchen, you have to have people there serve safe and all of those things. And if the whole area is without power, it's pretty hard to get food. So the Salvation Army is always kind of my go-to when we set up a shelter, when we need food right away. So that more agencies involved: local emergency management, like I talked about, local municipal health, Massachusetts emergency management. That's usually when it's a statewide disaster. And we would be working under ESF 8 and EFS 6. ESF 8 is public health, and when we have a disaster, I talk to them several times a day. And ESF 6 is sheltering, and generally Red Cross mans that phone. So I usually give them rosters and kind of an idea what's going on with the shelters, and they are amazing with resource management. That's kind of what MEMA does. As we need something here, it would be medical supplies and possibly food and bedding, but they do the whole gambit. They'll do power supply, they'll do DPW, all that stuff. So it's pretty amazing what MEMA does, and they do a great job. Again, MRC CERT, Red Cross, and then other agencies. Each community tends to have its own kind of superstars in the community. A lot of churches will step up. Sometimes there's a senior group. Sometimes the school has some great volunteers. So you'll find you'll get a lot of local assets when you have a shelter. Personal considerations, what it means to work in a shelter. And I'm going to just pose a real quick question. How many of you worked in the shelter? And you can put it in the chat. And how many of you ever stayed at a shelter? So those two things, go ahead and put that in the chat, and we can kind of get an idea of how many people have worked in shelters or seen them. What it means to deploy or not deploy. Again, I had a doctor that was driving from Concord to Fitchburg. She tells me she has baloney skins for tires. I found a volunteer that would pick her up, drive her to the shelter, and then drive her back. So it's really important to be talking to your volunteers as they deploy, just to make sure they're comfortable. And I usually send a kit, like a job action sheet, everything that they need, to all the directions, because GPS doesn't always work because power lines are down and things are like that. We've had to have the National Guard pick up people off the highway. So there's always special instructions when you deploy. So if you are asked to deploy, really read through all the details before you go, because generally those of us that coordinate those, I send out a good amount of information. Who's the on-site contact, what your job action sheet, what's the environment like, who you're relieving for a shift. So there's a lot of things that happen that should come from us. And you as volunteers, if you are deployed, ask questions. Sometimes I don't know, or we don't know all that information, but ask questions. And I always tell the volunteers, you're our eyes and ears. When you get there, you can text me, call me, you can kind of give me a lowdown of what's going on, just so I can prepare the next volunteer for the next shift. And any challenges you have, of course, you lean back on us, and we will try to fix it and try to find the resources that you need. Personal and family preparedness, we want to make sure your family's safe and that you're safe at home, that you have a go kit in your car, because generally you're traveling in pretty crappy environment. And again, directions are very important, because a lot of times roads are closed. Liability, supervision, and scope of work considerations, that's all information I would send in a packet when I deploy somebody. Most of you, I hope, know about the volunteer liability that's covered. Supervision, you would always get that in a job action sheet. So if you're getting deployed to dormitory, you go sign it with Christy, and she would kind of go over your scope of work. And what to do to be ready. So it could be bad driving, and maybe you don't have a great car, but you're a nurse and I need you there. And then I work with an organization, the Hummer Group, and they'll come and pick up people and drive them places. So there's a lot of resources. So if somebody asks you and you're like, wait a minute, my car's not great in the snow, or I don't feel comfortable, ask us. We might not be able to make it happen, but we might. So, you know, sometimes just having you there, and then a lot of times people that get driven there will spend a few shifts. Is not that you have to, but I've seen that happen. Volunteers will pack up and stay there for a few days, and that's also welcome as well. Of course, never self-deploy, and that's based on your unit's communication and protocols. We always send out a standby notification, but sometimes things happen quick. I mean, those tornadoes, man, those things rip through quick, and then you're like, holy crap, we gotta do something, because people are walking around the streets and their homes are destroyed. And then you must consider how comfortable you are at a shelter. It looks like many of you have worked in shelters, which is awesome. And what I would look at is, when I deploy people, I would ask the folks that know what they're doing to go first, because that's usually the most difficult situation, because, you know, like, they're still getting everything put together. And then you guys can be a little bit more open-minded about what's there, and you can tell us what we need. So that's another thing. You know, personal and family preparedness is key. I'm going to put everybody on the spot. If you don't have a family communication plan, go to rady.gov and put your plan together, because all of us know we use cell phones all the time. I don't know if it's coming out of the blur, but, you know, like, if our cell phones are dead, I mean, how many numbers do you remember? I mean, I used to memorize numbers, and there's some I have memorized, but most of them I don't. And then a go kit, you want to have all your stuff in your car, because even if you go to a shelter, there may not be toilet paper. There may not be, you know, there may not be like your personal items that you might want, deodorant, toothbrush, things like that. And then, of course, you listen for information. So generally what I've found is the most effective, and still has been over the years, is email. So it's surprising, but it does work. And texting, of course. Deployment, if interested, obviously send availability. I usually set up a questionnaire roster through mass response. You may or may not be chosen. Usually what I write in the directions, because I never have time to get back to everybody and say, oh, sorry, I didn't need you for this shift. If I don't send you directions that you're being deployed, you're not being deployed. So that's something that your unit would tell you. And then, of course, the instructions, don't self-deploy. What is the website for family preparedness? I'll type it in really quick, but it's rady.gov, and it has like pretty much everything in there. So just search out rady.gov, and it's great. And there's another thing in Massachusetts, it's called a ping alert, and I'll have Christy send that out as well, because that can tell you if there's disasters in your area. And Massachusetts has a number, Mass 211. That's a general number that you can call and find out what's going on at that time. They generally have pretty decent information. Sometimes not, but let me go over here again. What you bring, that's a very personal thing. When you talk about it, you really bring things that you think you would need. If you think, believe it or not, generally when there's general shelter operations, there's a lot of downtime. So you bring what you need. So you bring a book, or you bring a game, or I would bring my computer, because I would probably want to get some work done, things like that. And, you know, who will you coordinate with? You should obviously have someone from your MRC unit or local emergency management talking to you and telling you what you do when you get there. And if you don't know, and that can happen, I would ask the shelter manager. I would go right to the shelter manager and say, you know, I was given information to come here. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes we'll just send people because we don't know the needs yet. And then you go to that shelter manager and say, hey, I'm a nurse. Can I help out with that? They're like, no, we can't have you as a nurse, but we can help you do food. So, you know, be flexible when you go. And and what do you expect once you've been notified to be deployed? I try to give as much information as I can. And again, you guys are like our eyes and ears. And I see Chrissy just put up the ping alert, and that's an app on your phone, and it's an amazing tool. We'll talk about different components of a shelter. Job action sheets are my go-to. It tells you, when you arrive, what you do, or mobilization when the shelter's being set up, ongoing operations. It tells you demobilization. It tells you the supplies that are, I always say, that are ideal. You may not have all the supplies, but generally, like with registration, you should have certain supplies. Medical, you should have certain supplies. And if you need something, you ask us. Just-in-time training is generally what is given. And it really is incident specific. I've never seen any incident ever be the same. So just-in-time training is really key. And don't get stuck in what I tell you today, because it may be very different when you deploy, other than the basic rules of deployment and things like that. But each shelter has different challenges. Who's in charge? Generally, to start out with, it's the shelter manager, and that's the person that's been sent there to set up the shelter. And then the tiers start going spread. It's like incident command. So, generally registration is next, and then we look at dormitory and possibly food services, and then medical, behavioral health. So we just try to kind of fill in those slots as we have it available. And one thing that's huge with us is really mobilization and demobilization. I do a lot of training in that, like hands-on at a shelter, and we take all the stuff out. We lay it out. Everybody walks through the shelter and see how's everything's put together, and then pack it back up. Because again, every shelter looks different, and you may set it up that way, but you may change your mind because something works better. Given a situation, may have a lot of families there, or a lot of single men, or whatever, and you have to alter things. And then usually afterwards, there's a hot wash, ideally. I say that because a lot of times we don't have time for that. I look at the hot wash as when the volunteer ends the shift and gives me information, and if there's any issues, I can do a quick personal hot wash. But generally, you should be kind of switching over with the people you are you're covering the next shift with, and that's where you kind of tell what everything's going on. A hot wash is generally after the deployment. I always look at it as something that's ongoing, because you may only go once and you had this experience, and you may need to just give me a quick rundown about what happened. So if you look at this is a general shelter layout, but every shelter is different. So you just kind of look at it, you look at a good area for, it's usually a flow. You want to know who comes in and out. So you want to have the entrance, the registration is a main entrance generally. And there's a tool that worked really, really good with a lot of our shelters, is we gave the occupants numbers. And when they would leave, they would drop the number in a box. When they come back, they'd pick up their number, and that's assigned with their bed. Because a lot of times people would leave and not come back because their neighbor, hey, you can come stay with me, comes picks them up. So to me, that was a way that I found. And you worry, you ask the people, like, please call us and let us know you got a place to go. But sometimes that doesn't work. So the number in and out keeps a good head count. Because it's very transient. Again, you set up a first aid station that's usually tucked away, and generally that's where the nurse is. And potentially, like, if people come in with meds, you'll store narcotics or any pain meds or anything. They're controlled substances, you would store that in the nurse area. And then of course people are responsible for their own stuff. People may not give you the meds, but they can't say, hey, so and so stole it. That's something they need to take care of when they're in the shelter. Again, mental health counseling is key. A lot of it's just really giving people information. So within a shelter, I generally have 2 meetings, 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. and just kind of give people just the latest information that we know. Animals and pets, what we're seeing is a lot of co-sheltering, which is awesome when you have it. You don't always have it. And we ask people generally to take care of their own pets. And then they clean the box, we set up a schedule. And what we did with one place is actually we would put a wristband on them when they put their pet in, and we write the pet's name on a wristband. And then I know you guys have DART out there, and they have a whole system where they take a picture of the pet and all that. Command center is where generally your shelter manager will be, and any other leadership. They would come together, the team leaders, and they would talk there. And we try to have a good area for staff to take a break, because it's loud, there's a lot going on, and you guys need to kind of just take a break once in a while. So that's another place that's very important. Designated shelter areas, we kind of went over that. MRC roles in a shelter, client registration, again, it's usually a very general registration. We use the Red Cross CMIST thing, but sometimes you don't have that when you get to the shelter. So generally you just take a person's name, any medical issues they may have, who their emergency contact is off-site, and then, sometimes it's just written notes, just so you know. And then, of course, food services, we try to stay away from opening a kitchen, just because that brings a huge complexity to it. But if we can, we will open up a kitchen, and if it's long-term. For example, the Nepalese and Bhutanese and Islamic community, we couldn't bring food in, and it was in the summer. It was June, the month of June 2011, and their neighbors would come and they could eat outside. So that's something we worked out with the health director in West Springfield. Again, health and medical, we try to stay out of it as much as we can. Just really basic health and medical, and if there's a problem, you send them out EMS. But if there's not EMS, you may have to ramp it up a little bit more. So you may have to, like triage a potential break or something like that, or help people get their meds that they don't have. And a lot of times that involves a volunteer or a police officer driving back to a house and picking up meds if it's safe. Children's services are huge. Kids don't always understand the rules, and they have a blast. I remember taking my daughter when she was like 6. She's like, "Mom, can we stay here?" And I'm like, "Well, we got to go home. I got to get to the computer and do a bunch of stuff." But a lot of times there's a lot of kids running around. So we try to set up a play area, have activities. We had this wonderful just-in-time volunteer that came to the shelters in West Springfield. She was a daycare provider. She came every day with her daughter and did activities in the afternoon with the little kids. She was worth her weight in gold. Again, animal and pets, we try to manage that and have people do it. And then recreation, we try to, books, things like that. It's very hard. But if there's an area for recreation, that makes everybody much happier. We're going to go over incident command real quickly. Incident commander. Have most of you had incident command? I know you're a lot of new leaders. Christy, what's your sense of your volunteers? It depends on how deep I dig into this.
All of our approved volunteers have at least a basic introduction to incident command and public health.
Okay, awesome. So you guys kind of understand the hierarchy. We're usually under logistics. And then operations potentially. So when you look at incident command, that stuff above you is handled by the community or a regional entity. But there's always people above what we're doing, but we're a support function under logistics or operations. Again, incident command structure, you guys can look at this. I'll send you this PowerPoint just to refresh it if you'd like. Job action sheets are key. They identify special roles and aids and responsibilities and clarify who the supervisor is. And sometimes that changes. Yeah, I saw what Corin, obviously licensed people can do the mental health care and obviously the medical care. And that's why we have the MRC. So this is a draft job action sheet. This is a clerical unit leader. This person would be responsible for kind of any paperwork, the registration, any items that they need, their paper, like providing medical records, things like that. And as you see on this job action sheet, you see who that they would report to, They would have to attend staff meetings, receive assignments. So this tells you, actually, this is interesting. So this is from the state. So you have your leader, and that's your mission. And then you report. So in the initial phase, you would report to the clerical unit leader or the clerical supervisor if you work under her or he. And then, of course, generally there should be a briefing in the nice real world, but sometimes there isn't. Sometimes all you have is that job action sheet. You should receive your assignments when you arrive. But if you don't, reach out to your coordinator and they can help you, or the shelter manager. They look at supplies that are needed, and this is the mobilization phase. And familiarize with yourself with the layout of the shelter. You greet clients as they arrive, generally. So when you're a greeter, people walk in the door, you say, hello, I'm an MRC volunteer. I need you to come over here and register, and then just give them a quick idea of what they're expected to do in the shelter, just kind of the shelter rules. If they don't speak the languages, try to use an app, or let us know. If a lot of times Mass 211 will set up translation services. We generally have a lot of shelter signs that can be printed in multiple languages, things like that. But again, this is your first interaction with people when you're a greeter, and it's really important to give them some good information, because a lot of people are very frightened and very scared, and have like you should have a calm demeanor. And if something gets out of control, reach for your next up, the next person in line that in leadership, and it'll go up the food chain as something goes on. And if you see something really scary happening, say someone comes in with a gun, you go right to the police, things like that. But that's a job action sheet. You would get that. We'll go into more details about this. Just in time training is again key for each shelter. Your response skills sets may vary. Some people may be really friendly and great at greeting and have that nice demeanor where people walk in and they feel comfortable. And some people might be really good with dealing with paperwork. You know what I mean? So a lot of those times when you do that just-in-time training, they can identify what your skill is, and they can really kind of give you an idea of what you need to do. And if that information isn't there or needs to be there, ask for it. And if they don't have it, we can provide that for them. You want to discharging residents in an ideal situation. For someone who's run a lot of shelters, you want them to complete a discharge form, but sometimes they leave and thinking that they're going to come back, but they may not do that. So that's something ideally you want to do if you want to get them with connected services. But a lot of times their family will come in and they'll pick them up and you don't even see them again. So, but just try to discharge people if they're leaving, just because you can help them with connective services. But ideally when they register, if you detected a problem there, you would want to try to reach out to them again. Say if they had a mental disability and they went out for a walk, obviously you would kind of highlight them and be like, hey, we need to kind of make sure this person comes back, and things like that. Change of shift. Ideally you come in, you're like, hi Chrissy, this is Lisa, I'm covering you for dormitory. Like, what can you tell me over the last shift, what happened, and what am I expected to do? You will get a job action sheet, but generally the person that you change the shift with will have a good handle on what is going on in the shelter. You want to know what the facilities are, where the facility is, where the team leader is, obviously, the work that needs to be completed, what's in progress, what went well, areas of improvement. And it's critical for a smooth transition. It usually can be a couple-minute conversation. And that's important. And a lot of times the volunteer will tell me during their shift what goes on, and I will share that information with the new volunteer that's coming in to cover that shift. Again, communication is really the foundation of all of this. In this module, you'll recover the 3 R's. It's respect, routines, and rules. That's your backbone to this, and it gets you out of trouble. So if someone's asking for something you can't provide, like you can repeat the rules. The routines, usually it's lights on at 7, lights out at 10. They have to adhere to those rules. And then the routines, we have lunch at 12 o'clock, everybody shuts out their lights at 10 o'clock, things like that. The 3 C's of sheltering are comfort, communication, and cleanliness. A lot of times it's very hard to keep things clean when a lot of people are there. And a lot of times I'll ask the shelter occupants to really make sure they clean up after themselves. We all live in this thing together, and we're not there to wait on people and things like that. So I kind of run a hard and fast rule that everybody cleans up after themselves. There might be other stuff that we pick up, and then a lot of times people's shelter occupants will offer to help. So that's always a thing that's a challenge in there. And when people come in, I make sure that they know they're responsible for their stuff. They have to keep their area clean. They have to clean up where they've eaten. It's not a restaurant, things like that. That just makes it so much easier down the road. Because when we first started doing shelters, we're running around taking care of people like we're in a hotel, and you just can't do that. And then individuals requiring additional assistance, those folks may have wheelchairs, they may be deaf or blind, or have developmental disabilities. Those are things you want to identify and really kind of train your volunteers that are comfortable with dealing with that. Again, awareness with cultural competency. As you know, Massachusetts has so many different cultures, and you really want to respect that. Be very aware of body language. And if you don't understand the culture, go back and talk to your supervisor and see if there's some help there. So that's something to think about. Again, the respect all residents, respect all staff members. Sometimes people, like when it's been a long deployment, people get short with each other. Be understanding and try to diffuse the situation. Sometimes people don't agree on certain things. If there's 2 volunteers that don't agree, just kind of move up the food chain and ask for another opinion. Don't take things personally. That is something that always comes up in a shelter, is people's personalities may not work well together. Just keep it calm. Just really try to just think of the greater good and the mission of the shelter. Again, establish that daily routine. I even have it put up on a whiteboard, lights on at 7, lights out at this, only 1 person in a bathroom at a time, or whatever. So that's something that would kind of be within each individual area, but that's very important to have that routine. And then the rules, like obviously no weapons, there's no, what I mean? There's no drugs in there, illicit drugs, there's no alcohol. And you will have people, that population a lot of times ends up in shelters, and sometimes you have to deal with that. So just kind of really give those rules and kind of keep an eye out and enforcing them, because once people don't follow the rules, everybody else won't follow them. Comfort. Promote a relaxed atmosphere. Generally, if you see something people agitated, and you have the staff, try to pull them aside in a separate room and try to figure out what's going on. Depending on the reason why the shelter's put in place, the person could be very agitated because they don't know where their dog is, or their horse, or what I mean? So things like that, and try to answer honestly and try to figure out what's going on, and try to just give them good, honest information, and try to provide the information by asking leadership within the shelter and see if you can find out, because a lot of times they can talk to the cops and they say, hey, we're out, we know that we heard that dog was there, we're going to go pick it up, or whatever. Communication, it's so important to communicate. If something's festering or you have a question about anything, just ask whoever you're with. Don't take anything personally. Just try to really communicate really well, really clearly. Keep your attitude really comfortable, and just really willing to listen to others and to share information with others, because that's a key. And then cleanliness, again, I kind of run a tight ship like that because it can get out of hand really quickly. I went to visit the shelter out at the Big E. I go into the bathroom. There's toothbrushes up and down like I'm below the mirror. I'm like, oh my God, like just nothing wrapped and like toothbrushes there. So I walk down with my glove and like scoop it all. And the new rules, like everybody keeps the toothbrush with them. You know what I mean? So certain things like that, like just kind of getting ahead of it. Just kind of keep a nice, clean, even cleaner than your own house, a non-discrimination principles, you have to be pretty careful with the non-discrimination principles, self-determination, like whatever people feel who they are, don't argue with them. And you just like, obviously, most of us are pretty accustomed to this because there's been a lot of education about this lately. No one size fits all. There's different situations. Sometimes you may have to separate a family or whatever. You want to also do equal opportunity. If people want to help and it's a safe situation, you want to have them do that, or, you want to make sure everybody's receiving the same services. You want to make sure people are included. If people are back in a corner, find out why they're back there and try to figure out if it's a language barrier or they can't hear or a mental disability, just to mitigate any issues. So you want to make sure everybody, particularly volunteers and then certainly occupants, are involved. Integration. What I find is people go in clusters because generally a disaster happens in a neighborhood. So neighborhoods may stick together and build a little cluster of beds together. So kind of let that happen naturally. But if there's a problem, you kind of might need to move people around. Physical access, that can sometimes be challenging depending on the equipment you have. For example, cots are very challenging for a lot of people to get in and out of. So that's something that, you may want to talk to a family member. Hey, this person needs a help. You may only have these cots and you have to work with those and just kind of figure out a way if they need a chair next to them to pull up or something like that. Effective communication, program modification. You need to kind of edit things as you go along to make it work. And then obviously there's no charge for service. CMIST, again, I'm gonna beat this with a dead horse. It's communication, obviously medical, independent supervision, and transportation. Generally, when you're looking at a shelter, you're trying to close it as fast as you can. So you want to get all the services you can, just so you can get people out of there and placed. And there'll be a lot, the incident commander, the shelter manager, all of that. You start asking them for stuff. You're like, like clothes, like some people need clothes, or, like we needed, with the gas explosions, we need, electric appliances because like people had gas stoves and things like that. So like you look at those things and you ask as a volunteer, because when you start asking, people start delivering. And same with the people that are in the shelter. If they start asking for stuff, obviously that's reasonable, you take care of that. And then medical, again, we license medical professionals. That's why we have the MRC. We always check that before they deploy. Again, we want people to be super independent, take care of themselves, take care of their families. We're providing a roof and we're providing some resources, but really they should be taking care of everything that they possibly can. Again, you have to supervise. Something's going on. You really want to mitigate any issue that's coming up, someone being loud or disrespectful or whatever, pull them aside and just say, we can't have this. And then transportation has always been pretty challenging depending on the event, but there are usually amazing resources in the communities and you tap into those resources that are already there. Functional needs, economic disadvantage. Generally, that's who we get in a shelter. If it's a small event, if it's a larger event, then we kind of get everybody in the geographic area. But, like a lot of people end up staying at friends, they have a car, they can drive. Some people don't have that. So that's something you see a lot of times that they come in, and that's a hard disparity to work with because they get stuck where do they go? You work with the town, the community, have social workers come in and look at, placement, look at all those things that you have in the community. And again, your shelter manager can do it. Language and literacy, there's amazing apps you can put on your phone. Early on, when I was working in shelters a million years ago, we didn't have those. There's an amazing Show Me guide that comes from the state. You can order them for free. They're a flip book, and you can point at medical stuff, and you can kind of figure out your way through that without a language app. And sometimes you don't have good Wi-Fi, you don't have cell coverage, and then you're using that Show Me tool. Christy, can you put that in there? Because people, I think they can even download it on their phones now, the Show Me tool.
I'll see if I can find that.
Yeah, and then of course, isolation. A lot of folks, we'll get folks that are really homebound that'll get dropped off at a shelter. What I demand is when someone's dropped off is that their caregiver comes with them and stays in the shelter. So that's something, when we talk about isolation, there's been a lot of drop-offs that happen at shelters, and we're scrambling to try to figure out how to take care of them. So be on the lookout when you're on registration, when someone drops off, or if you're at the door, just kind of really say, hey, your caregiver has to come in here with you. And then of course, age is always an issue. We get a lot of elderly folks that, this situation is pretty challenging for them. Cultural competency, awareness, acceptance of differences, awareness of a cultural values. Sometimes the man of the family will be the person that speaks, and they may not want to talk to a woman. Just be aware of that and just try to mitigate it. You may not be able to make it work, but just really look at those cues that you get. And it's hard to understand everybody's culture. A lot of times you'll have a child that speaks English, and you can ask that child if they can ask the parent or whatever, what the preferred communication technique is. Some people may be very afraid and they may be leaning away. So you want to kind of have a quiet presence, not be asking a million questions, just try to slowly get some information out of them so you can help them. And then again, just every day, look at the world when you're out in the world and develop cultural knowledge. Luckily, for many years, there wasn't a lot of information out there, but now it's very readily available. And I'm sure you guys share cultural competency classes with your volunteers. And then your ability to adapt to different activities. It kind of depends on your occupants, the kitty, depends on the occupants, whether or not, like what ends up happening. So sometimes they get together and they play cards or whatever like that. So you just kind of be very open-minded. Volunteers should not be put in any uncomfortable situations. Any volunteer that I have that's ever in an uncomfortable situation, their first thing is to go talk to their team leader and just say, this situation is very uncomfortable for me. I can't deal with it. Or even if it makes you a little bit uncomfortable and you're feeling really uneasy, you need to bring it up to the leadership. And then certainly, if you're deployed and there's no one to tell and no one addresses it, you come back to us, the MRC leaders, and we'll take care of that as well. So, that's, you always, if you're uncomfortable, don't ever put yourself in an uncomfortable situation that you feel like your safety, particularly your safety, is in danger. Because sometimes people wander off and maybe you'll follow that client. It may feel uncomfortable and you just walk away and go tell the cop that's at the door or the shelter manager. Always request a job action sheet, because it just kind of gives you an idea what to do. Again, every shelter may be a little bit different, but it just kind of gives you an idea of what you should be trying to achieve at dormitory or food services. Approach a safety officer when necessary. 9 times out of 10, we have a cop there. I mean, I would say 10 times out of 10, there's generally a police officer at the shelter, and then a lot of times EMS. So whenever there's any issues that come up that you see that is a potential danger for another volunteer or yourself, please go up and alert them and alert obviously your team leader. report and defer to managers. I know I keep saying that, but any issue that comes up, bring it to them, because they'll bring it to us and we'll try to fix it, you know, or make the situation better. We don't know about it until you tell us. And be aware that the manager is always available as a resource. That's what we're there to do, is make sure everything goes smoothly, and we're there to make sure that you guys have everything you need and that everything is safe. How do you kick someone out? I just saw that. And where do they go? Generally, it's a police issue. I'll give you a couple of interesting scenarios. We had a bunch of drunk trick-or-treaters show up at a shelter in Bedford, Massachusetts, and we called the cops. So, I mean, you could try to deal with it. And then in one place, we had a known pedophile, and we had him PC'd. So it's a police issue. Anytime you need to kick someone out, hopefully, so I see what notification we required as a sex offender. They are supposed to identify when they come, and the law is, from what I understand, is we're supposed to take them. And I don't always have a problem. I have a problem with that. So in my shelters, I talk to the police officer, and they get a better deal anyway. They usually PC them, and they get a room to themselves and better service than we can provide to them. What about an elderly person that the caregiver leaves? We call the caregiver, you know, and it does happen. And then sometimes what we'll do is recruit a volunteer that can help with that person. Sometimes we may not have the facility to deal with the person that comes, say they're bedridden or, you know, not ambulatory. We may not have the stuff. We try to get them in either into the hospital or nursing home, but your public health department and emergency manager should be able to deal with that. That's something that generally that's what we do, because you don't want people being unsafe, particularly if all you have is cots and you have somebody coming in that, you know, certainly can't get on and off a cot. In lieu of that, when we didn't have services like we have now, we put people in recliners and just kind of made it work. But you really should ask the question, what do we do with that person, and do a needs assessment and see if we can actually take care of them there, if we have the equipment. Really try to track down that caregiver. So that's something. I have a pet peeve about that. I think the caregiver is required, and when they come in, if they're in a wheelchair, the first thing you ask is, where's your caregiver? How'd you get here? You know, and chase them down the street, you know, get back in here, you know. So again, that's kind of something you really need to have. And if they're getting paid by the state or their home health aid or something like that, and they would be getting paid, you know, they should be coming in and doing their service. And again, please call us. Like, I'm a catch-all when I'm coordinating and managing a shelter. Just come to me, ask me the question. If I don't know it, I will find it out. And I know your team leaders are the same way. They're wonderful. I've known them for many, many years. So again, acknowledgements for the course are from FEMA, Red Cross, Boston MRC, Region 4A, DeValier. There's great trainings online with DeValier. There's Western Mass Sheltering Projects and MRCs, and then the AAR from the Otis Air Force Base. But what I want to do is kind of, since we've kind of gotten through all this, I want to open it up for discussion. And Christy, if you don't mind kind of managing people raising their hand and then unmuting them,
Sure,
can you do that?
absolutely.
And just ask anything. So.
Looks like Carmela has a question.
Awesome. Go ahead, Carmela.
I do. I don't know which camera's on. Okay.
You look good. You're great. Yeah, we see you. Yeah.
So I know that throughout Massachusetts, there's a lot of opioid addiction. Yes. And I took a sheltering course and they addressed that. Mm-hmm. And because when people are in the shelter, they're not allowed to bring their drugs, and then they go through withdrawal, and then you have an emergency on your hands. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
So we've talked, it's interesting. We have a very robust opiate program in the southern part of the southwest eastern part of the state that I cover, Fall River, New Bedford area. We would actually try to get them placed if we could. We have a great connection with Star and Seven Hills, but if that's not the case, and somebody's detoxing and really, because they can get into a lot, and alcohol detoxes, they can die. Again, that's kind of a 911 call. It's hard to say. You want to say you can set up a place for them to be able to use. I don't think I would do that in one of my shelters. I would tap into every resource I could possibly do before that. And you certainly want to catch them before, like you can start seeing that they're detoxing or overdosing. And of course you want to have Narcan in the shelter. You may not even know that. Most times you might not know that they're an opiate addict. They come in, they fall asleep and, something like that. But of course, Narcan should be there, but it's generally a 911 call like it would be in any other situation. And, hopefully the ambulance services are there and they have all that. But I would recommend Narcan or naloxone to be in a shelter. But sometimes that's not the situation, and you would hopefully try to identify that when they're coming in. But again, I would tap into every resource I had. I would, obviously watch the person. Hopefully you'd identify somebody having trouble ODing, or ODing is more what I would worry about than detox. They're alive. But that would be a 911 call. Did that answer your question, Carmela? What did they come up with? I would love to hear what they said.
What I remember is that they said to have Narcan and know how to use it.
Yep.
And, to keep your eye out for people going off into
corners and
whatever and acting weird. I'll put my camera on again. I don't, that's what I remember.
Yeah.
But you don't ask people when they come in, oh, by the way, are you a user? Are you
they're not going to tell you, you know what I mean? They're not going to tell you. I'm going to exit out of this stop share so I can see everybody's faces. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting when you think about it. I would tap into every resource I could, unless I had, for some reason, like one of my superstar volunteers that deal with opioids is there, and but in any case, OD or detox, I would call 911. And if it wasn't available, hopefully you have Narcan there, but it's like you would react in any other situation. So unless it's everybody's out, and then you have to deal with it in a different situation, and then you would reach out to your group and find a subject matter expert in it. You know what I mean? Someone that deals with substance use. That's what I would do. And, I've had people come into my shelters with issues like that. And generally, like I said, it's a 911 call, So I hope that answered it for you. But if, ideally have naloxone there, the new preparations we teach, Narcan training or naloxone training, it's pretty easy to use now. You don't have to put everything together.
Right.
But
you don't have to mix it.
Yeah, exactly. But generally, ideally at a shelter, you would like to have EMS there. And if you don't, that's something I think the shelter manager should discuss with the emergency management director and say, hey, give us some Narcan from your bus, so we have it here, and you know what I mean, and do us a quick training for, people that might not know how to use it. It's pretty easy now, thank God. But that's a great question. And it does happen. It's tricky. So thank you for that. Anybody else?
So I have a question.
Yes.
We have a disaster animal response trailer that is pretty well equipped.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's awesome.
Deployment.
Your dark trailer, yeah.
So I'm curious about some of your experience with, you had talked about co-sheltering with pets and people. Can you talk a little bit about how that looks we've
Mhm.
talked with some of our DART volunteers about setting up a animal shelter, but not so much as it relates with a
The
people shelter.
co-shelter. I
So,
mean, ideally you would want a co-shelter, but it may not work. So sometimes you may have to have the shelter, it just may not work. But if it is, like, you can take I went to a session out where you guys are a long time ago, and they had put, like, everything up along the walls in the hallway, and they were able to build like a shelter there, an animal shelter. And at that time, they would have been doing all the care themselves. So, but a co-shelter, ideally, again, you want to match the person with the pet, and you want to make sure that they're taking care of the pet and cleaning the cage. And that's an issue we always run into, is really just a cleanliness issue, maybe space, all of that. So we generally ask people to take care of their own pets, walk their dogs, and it's a scheduling thing. So, numerical order or however it works to schedule it. And again, I think it's really important to identify, not everybody has the fancy stuff that DART has, the camera where they take a picture of the owner and put it on the cage, and the pet with the owner, and all of that. Sometimes just a simple wristband or a card or something that you write the pet's name on, the cage number, and the person's name, just so somebody doesn't pet nap, like, I don't know if people would do it, but they do,
we
so
talked about that during the training. Yep. It's
yeah.
always a
So,
potential.
so that's just kind of that identification. You set up a schedule. And really, shelter occupants in my mind should be taking care of most everything. And then we pick up the pieces where it doesn't work. Because in larger shelters that I've run, it can get unwieldy so quickly if the occupants aren't taking care of them, and they expect us to serve, wait on them like a hotel. And a lot of it's just communication, just because you may not have enough volunteers depending on the situation. So I like to start it really small and then just kind of deal with it if you have to on the outside. But the co-sheltering, people walk their own dogs, clean their own cages. Ideally they would bring food, but that almost never happens. So like, we get donations from supermarkets and things like that, and kitty litter boxes and things like that. So that's the ideal situation. But you and I have a particularly challenging situation with horses. We don't talk a lot about that in the state. Luckily I have an automatic water, and hopefully they can shelter in place, but I also have a trailer that I would take them with me somewhere, and just because I camp with them, I can certainly tie them up to a tree, but again, so that's something, you have to think about. But it's challenging. And again, if I had a preference for someone who's run many shelters over the years, it would be they would take care of their own animals. But sometimes it doesn't work. And a lot of times we do a lot of the smart training, generally small animals, but you get exotic animals. We always talk about that, and that's, again, particularly challenging. That's where you want the person who owns the animal to take care of them. Even if you had to bus, you know what I mean? Like, or even if it's a totally separate location, there might be a way to work that out, but there's lots of capable people. You and I could go in there and probably handle a lot of the animals and deal with it. So but at first line, I would say people take care of their own animals.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, I hope that answered your question in a roundabout way.
Certainly did.
And a lot of times, towns will have agreements with like doggy daycares, veterinary offices, and then that a lot of times they're used to taking care of the animals. We can get volunteers to backfill what they're doing. So there's a lot of models that work. But a co-shelter is pretty easy to set up if you have the resources, and you can get the resources from MEMA. They had sheltering kits that came out, I think, almost 10 years ago, that had cages and all that stuff. And you can always look at donations. So think outside the box, whatever your situation is, but just kind of make it work. So
Perfect.
thank you. Great question.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Oh my goodness.
Yes, you were very thorough.
I hope so. But if you have any follow-up questions, you can, like, email me or email Christy, and I can follow up with it. I'll share the PowerPoint. It's pretty simple. The next training, I don't know how many of you are going to join in, but we're going to do a lot of scenarios. And we're kind of going to work as a team and figure out the best way to handle the different scenarios we throw out there. So I hope you join us for our next session, but it's more about leadership. And if you would be a registration leader, a food services leader, a behavioral health leader, medical, or even work, I mean, you can even take shelter manager courses and things like that. So I hope I see a lot of you next week. And we can, even if you don't want to be a leader, you can listen in and ask questions, but that's the next module. But thank you all for your time. And I'm sorry I talk really fast, but it was a pleasure to present to you. And this is a different venue. I'm used to doing this in person, but thank you. And it was a great conversation.
Thank you, Lisa.
Lisa,
Great.
thank you. Yeah, it was a
Great
wealth of
class.
information.
Yeah, thank you.